Good morning to those folks joining us now. Just to let you know, we're waiting for a few extra people to join us. So I'll start introducing our wonderful panel in about a minute. Thank you for your patience. Good morning, everyone, again. Welcome to session 1, group 2. As I said back in the plenary introduction, my name is Eliza Bateman. I work here at the University of Ottawa Refugee Hub. I'm thrilled to welcome so many experts and researchers on community sponsorship with us this morning. This session is going to feature some really exciting new research projects and papers from researchers who are all looking in various ways and at different angles of the impacts of community sponsorship. It's a fantastic group of papers. We look at both the macro and then go right down to the micro level of particular programs in different countries. I'm thrilled to introduce our presenters. How I'm going to manage this morning is I will introduce presenters and then give them a chance to do their presentation. And I think we might hold the Q&A until we've had all our presentations, just to make sure everybody gets an equal chance to share. And then I have a few questions that I would love to ask the panel, but would also love to hear from the audience. Please feel free to put your questions in the chat and we'll do our best to get them to the presenters so they can answer them. So I'll start by introducing Ryan Briggs and Robert Falconer this morning. Ryan Briggs is an associate professor in the Department of Political Science and Guelph Institute of Development Studies at the University of Guelph. His research uses statistics and atypical data sources to learn about ways to do an outsized amount of good in the world. His recent research has focused on the politics of immigration. Before that, his research focused on ways to make foreign aid more effective. I'd like to also welcome Robert Falconer. Robert Falconer is a research associate at the School of Public Policy at the University of Calgary. He specialises in refugee and asylum policy, using quantitative methods to address the issues facing newcomers. His qualifications include a Master of Public Policy from the University of Calgary, a Bachelor of Arts from the University of Toronto. Robert was recently awarded the Joseph Armand Bombardier Doctoral Scholarship from the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council for prospective work into refugee sponsorship. So welcome, Ryan and Robert, and over to you.
Thank you. Just to confirm time, we're aiming for just a few minutes of a quick pitch, right?
Yeah, 4 to 5 minutes would be fantastic.
Awesome.
Thank you.
Yeah, no problem. So hi, I'm Ryan Briggs. I'm going to talk briefly about some work that I'm doing with Rob Falconer. It's really early stage, so we're really interested in feedback. So most research on private sponsorship focuses on refugee outcomes. This makes a lot of sense, but it could also be the case that sponsorship could be really important, possibly transformative to sponsors and to the people that know sponsors, right? People in their social networks, communities, people around them. One problem, if you're trying to look into this, is it's really hard to confidently say what sponsorship does to sponsors. If you sort of do this like the obvious way, you could just survey a bunch of sponsors, but then this doesn't tell you if sponsorship has actually changed them. The people that decide to sponsor are atypical in a lot of ways. If you want to know about maybe does sponsorship change attitudes to immigration, the people that choose to sponsor are probably more open to immigration in the first place, right? So it's really hard to figure this out. You could try to do something maybe before and after, survey people before they sponsor, survey them after. The problem there is a lot of things can happen in the space of like a year. COVID could happen, and then it's really hard to disentangle the differences between anything else that happened over time. So in medical research, what you would do is just run a really big experiment. You'd have a real control group and you'd randomize people to like become sponsors. We can't do that for good reason. And so our research plan leverages the fact that sponsors often wait in wait lists. And so because of that, we have this group of people very often that have sort of decided to sponsor, but they haven't actually started this yet. And we think these people are likely really comparable to the people that have decided to sponsor, but we're just a little bit ahead of them in the queue. And so I've been doing sponsorship for 6 months, 8 months, 10 months. And so our plan is to run surveys of people that are waitlisted and compare those responses against people who have been doing sponsorship for 10 months to a year. And our hope is that this can let us disentangle the causal effect of sponsorship, how it changes people's attitudes. And if we find out who the friends are of those groups, then our sort of extra hope is that we can run surveys of those friends and see if these effects spill out into social networks. So is it the case that people's attitudes to immigration change if they have a friend sponsor? Maybe they see posts on social media about this, people talking about this, they talk to their friends about this, and this shifts their attitudes towards refugees or immigration. Or does it affect levels of social trust, or does it affect voting intentions? So right now we're looking for partners and for feedback on the research design. So we've had conversations with the Canadian government and that's moving forward, but we're also really interested in talking to just as many potential partners as possible. We're really pretty open here in what a partner might look like. And so, so long as someone has contact information for people that are planning to be sponsors and people that have kind of gone forward, then those are people that we would really love to talk to and love to hear about what they're working on. We're pretty open with the exact setup. So if someone is aware of something and it doesn't exactly fit what I described, the way I think about this is, as researchers, like, our job is the causal inference and figuring out how to make that work. And we're pretty good at that. But we need to partner with organizations that are actually doing all of this stuff on the ground and are interested in figuring out what sponsorship might do to people. So I'm going to leave a link in the chat that gives a little bit more information. So if anyone wants to see a little bit more about the project or find our contact info or anything like that, there's a PDF there. And thank you very much for inviting us. Look forward to questions. I think I'll probably turn most of those over to Rob, who's the real expert on refugee politics. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Ryan, and thank you, Ryan and Robert, for your excellent project overview. It's so interesting. I know we've been in touch on this separately. I hope that it's something we can continue to work with you on. And thank you very much, Ryan, for keeping to a very tight 4 minutes. That was very impressive. Next, I'd like to welcome Gabriella Agatiello, and I'd like to apologize to her if I mispronounced her name. Please correct me. Sometimes I wasn't too wrong. Okay. Sometimes my Australian accent proves to be a little bit of a problem, so apologies. Gabriella joined ICMC Europe and the SHARE Network in 2021, and it leads the organization's work on refugee sponsorship. She previously worked on EU policy and advocacy related to social inclusion, migrant inclusion, and labour rights for a number of EU-based organisations. Before moving to Europe, she worked in the immigrant and refugee settlement sector in Canada and in research and community development in Argentina. Gabriella holds a master's degree in political science and social work from York University and the University of Toronto, and a postgraduate diploma in migration management from Maastricht University. Welcome, Gabriella. We're really looking forward to listening to your project this morning.
Thank you, Eliza, for the nice introduction, and thank you to the Refugee Hub for inviting ICMC Europe and the SHARE Network to present this new and exciting research project we're leading on at the moment. I should say that it's very much in the initial stages. Right now, we're just still doing the desk research, but I thought maybe it would be a nice opportunity to connect with other folks doing research in the area and let you know what we're doing. For those of you who are not familiar with our organization and our work on sponsorship, I should say I'm not an academic or researcher, so I'm speaking more from a policy perspective, but I would like to tell you some of the research objectives of this work. So ICMC Europe, through the SHARE Network, is currently leading what we call the Quality Sponsorship Network. And basically, the network supports pilots and ad hoc sponsorship initiatives to develop into sustainable community-driven programs. And it brings a consortium of actors in different countries across Europe, including Belgium, France, Germany, Ireland, Italy, Spain, and the United Kingdom. And these are all partners who are experienced in refugee integration work and are currently carrying out community sponsorship programs in their own national contexts and implementing them. So most of them are lead sponsor organizations or supporting organizations, and the one in Spain is it's a regional government. So as part of our monitoring and evaluation work, we are working with external evaluators in each of these countries to assess how sponsorship programs in these countries are completely working on the ground. So most of the research so far, the initial research in Europe has looked more at program design and the different actors that are involved in sponsorship. And we want to look more closely on what's happening on the ground, for example, with volunteers, with local authorities, with refugees, with the lead and support organizations and the wider community, and how these actors are working together. So the 6 external evaluators in each of these countries will be coordinated by 2 independent research consultants. One of them is Marisol Reyes, and the other one is Gabriella Agatiello, who I believe is in the audience today. And they're both presenting today on the research on sponsorship in the UK, I believe. So the overall goal of the research project is basically to identify challenges and outcomes in the different programs in these countries, with a view to providing information to help all the different stakeholders involved in their delivery, to improve the program's design, and ultimately we hope to enhance refugee integration. To give you a bit of background into some of the objectives, we hope that the research will look into the design and key characteristics of the sponsorship model operating in each of the countries, and explain more clearly what the roles and responsibility of the different stakeholders in the scheme are. For example, including an assessment of the sponsor group volunteer recruitment strategies and how the groups go about forming themselves and the different recruitment strategies that they use. We will look again into the challenges and the various factors that make the transition into what we call autonomous living, or the end of the sponsorship period, or what some people call the transition to the 13th month. And look into exploring ways to mitigate those difficulties. We hope the evaluation will aim to highlight areas of best practices, which stakeholders can then use to design more effective and efficient future programs, as well as looking into potential areas for program growth. And lastly, and this is one of the research objectives which we are, I guess, most excited about, because not a lot has been done on this, with the exception of maybe Canada and the UK, is to explore the impact of sponsorship in the engagement of the wider community outside of the sponsor group, and kind of the transformative nature of sponsorship for the community. So for example, by identifying what kind of community practices either support or hinder the integration and social inclusion of sponsored refugees, by identifying the network of organizations and individuals who have engaged with refugees via the volunteer sponsors and the wider community, and how this has impacted the refugees' overall integration, by comparing, for example, rural and urban setting, and identifying the differences between rural and urban settings and how it affects the refugees' integration process and their sense of belonging to their new location or to the new community. And we also have some more specific, in each country, the external evaluators will be looking at more specific objectives that are more context specific. So for example, some partners or some evaluators will be analyzing refugees' engagement and participation in each of the stage of the programs. Others will be looking at existing practices that facilitate fruitful intercultural exchanges. Others will be looking at mechanisms and practices that are successful in recruiting and sustaining and scaling up sponsor groups. So those are the more context-specific objectives, and the others are more the kind of general objectives for the 6 partner countries. But so I hope that gives you a brief overview, and I'm happy to answer any questions that you might have after the panel. And I will put a link to the Quality Sponsorship Network project in the chat, just so you have more information about it. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Gabriella. It sounds like a fascinating project. We're always so excited to see M&E-based research, informing, I guess, evidence-based program design. It's fantastic, and I hope we can stay in touch on it as well. So our first two projects looking more at, I guess, macro level impacts of sponsorship and regional or macro and potentially comparative in Gabriella's case. But turning now, I want to look at some of the presenters who are looking at community sponsorship in specific locations and some of the impacts of sponsorships in those locations. So first, I'd like to introduce Natasha Nichols and ask her to speak a little bit about her research. Natasha is a PhD student at the Institute for Research into Superdiversity at the University of Birmingham. She also works as an RA on a project focusing on migrant descendants' intercultural competence. Her doctoral research focuses on the UK community sponsorship scheme, and her research specifically explores the experiences of volunteers involved with the scheme and the relationships between the volunteers and refugees, and how involvement in community sponsorship shapes the civil society trajectory of volunteers. And she also recently co-authored an article which explored the cycle of emotions within community sponsorship. Welcome, Natasha. I'd love to learn more about your research.
Thanks, Eliza, and thanks for having me here today. I was trying to come up with the title for this really short presentation, just in the hope of also helping me to think about my analysis. And I called it Considerations of Time and Place on the Experience of the UK Community Sponsorship Volunteers. So my PhD focuses on the experiences of volunteers who are involved in community sponsorship in the UK. And it's sort of centered around these two overarching research questions, these two kind of main ones. So firstly, how do the volunteers perceive their role that they have with the refugees they sponsor, and how do these roles and how do these relationships they have with the refugees change over time as the family kind of becomes more integrated or possibly not integrated into the local community. And then secondly, I'm looking at the civil society trajectory of the volunteers. So what happens to them after community sponsorship in theory comes to an end, or what happens to them, what happens to their volunteering work or their civil society action whilst they're undertaking community sponsorship. So under the UK scheme, support from the volunteer group should last for 2 years. So this gave quite a useful timescale to investigate the questions that I wanted to look at. And to do this, I divided the volunteers into 3 different groups. So I've got those who are preparing to welcome a family, those whose family have arrived, they arrived in the last 2 years, and volunteers whose family arrived more than 2 years ago. So I could kind of try and look at the changes over time across these 3 key time points in the UK kind of community sponsorship journey. Time restrictions with my PhD funding and also the impact of COVID sort of prevented a full longitudinal study that I originally thought I would like to do. But I felt like speaking to volunteers at different points of this journey would allow me to have an insight into the changes over time that they experienced. I really wanted to weave place into the research in some kind of way. Groups in the UK are really geographically different, and I was really interested to explore the impact that would have on my questions and the impact that it had on the groups themselves. There's groups in rural locations, in towns, and there's lots of groups in cities as well. And I really felt like looking at the differences between these areas and the groups would provide a sort of interesting angle to my research. And I also really wanted to visit the communities where sponsorship was happening. I was a bit loath to let the pandemic get in my way. So to that end, to collect my data, I've mainly focused on using socially distanced walking interviews, which enabled me to visit the communities and speak to volunteers face to face, but also respecting kind of COVID guidelines. And it was very popular actually to do a walking interview. It was more popular than doing a Zoom interview, which was great. But I did also give that option for there were a few people who weren't comfortable meeting, which was fine. And it gave an interesting perspective actually between the two different forms. So I'm at the point of my project where I've almost finished my data collection. I've got a couple of interviews left, and I've undertaken almost 30 in-depth interviews with volunteers. And I'm just starting to work out the kind of coding framework that I'd like to use. I thought it might be interesting to share kind of an insight from my initial analysis, particularly looking at place. So what's been really interesting is learning about the real and genuine impact that place does have on how volunteers view their roles, and how this in turn impacts on the relationships that they have with the refugee family, or that they kind of allow themselves to have. And this is, when I'm talking about place, I'm referring to kind of the geographic location of the group, as well as the kind of like the socioeconomic makeup of that specific place. So whether it's rural or urban, and whether it's, you know, whether it's an expensive place to live, whether it's a cheap place to live. So kind of looking at both aspects. And yeah, to give an example, there's one place where the rent was quite expensive, and some of the volunteers I spoke to, they were kind of expressing that they had to take on this kind of authoritative role. They felt they had to kind of put that shield up, because they were actually really worried that the refugee family didn't realize that they wouldn't be able to stay after 2 years, because the group knew they couldn't afford it. And they felt that it was their responsibility as a volunteer to keep reminding them of that. They felt a little bit awkward, and they kind of put up that boundary between themselves and the family, because they knew they wouldn't be able to stay. I thought that was really interesting. It kind of, yeah, created the relationship, the kind of geography and how expensive the rent was. And again, just on the topic of locations that were expensive to live in a couple of cases, volunteers expressed that maybe their area being expensive rent, expensive food shops, in some cases, you know, maybe it wasn't an ideal location for a refugee family to be resettled, because although they intended and they hoped to have this longer term relationship with the family past this kind of 2-year period, actually, because of the expense of renting a house in that particular area, after 2 years, the family themselves had to move, which disrupted those kind of community bonds and that community support that had been created around them. So actually the groups themselves are almost, they were kind of waiting for that 2 year to happen, and then the family would move. And it really affected the relationship that they had with them, because they felt they had this kind of timeline as to when the support would end and the family would move. And they were moving, in that particular case, they were moving kind of 15 miles away. So it was like a considerable, and beforehand they were just around the corner. So yeah, just 2 insights into this kind of impact of place. And then my next step is to really properly start my analysis. And I look forward to sharing more details in the future. So thank you so much for listening. I hope I didn't go over. I have a tendency to ramble.
Not at all. Thank you very much, Tash. It sounds so interesting, and I particularly want to learn more from you as you do your data collection and go through it, looking at, as you said, that relationship question between sponsors and newcomers, and how those relationships can be, I guess, made more respectful and more productive. It's so interesting. Thank you. I'd like to turn now to introduce Emily Lin, and then after Emily, Pablo Bos, both researchers doing really interesting research into community sponsorship in the United States, which is an exciting new frontier, or maybe new field, is less of a loaded term for sponsorship. But introducing Emily to you all first. Emily is a candidate for the Master of Arts in Global Human Development at Georgetown University. She's pursuing a certificate in refugees and humanitarian emergencies. Prior to studying at Georgetown, she founded and directed the Canopy of Northwest Arkansas, a refugee resettlement agency in Fayetteville, Arkansas. And currently her research focuses on the impact of community sponsorship on refugee labour market outcomes in the United States. Welcome, Emily.
Thank you so much, Eliza. Thank you all for having me and allowing me to share my research with all of you. As Eliza said, I'm currently researching the impact of community sponsorship in the United States on refugee labor market outcomes. And as Eliza mentioned, there has not been a lot of research done on community sponsorship in the United States. There hasn't been a very strong policy focus on sponsorship until very recently. There's a lot of momentum at the moment, and so I'm hoping that this research, as preliminary as it is, will provide some helpful insights in the policy space. So I've obtained some administrative data from the Lutheran Immigration and Refugee Service, which is one of 9 national resettlement agencies that partners with the US State Department to welcome and resettle refugees across the United States. And they have a variety of administrative data they've been able to share with me, including some basic biographic information on all the refugees that they've received. So nationality, gender, household size, age, etc., things like that. The location of resettlement, the date of resettlement, as well as some very basic employment outcome information. So were they employed? What were their wages? How long did it take them to secure employment? And this employment information in the United States is typically collected between 90 and 180 days after arrival. So I've been able to secure 10 years of data, so data on 35,000 households. And I've been analyzing the impact of sponsorship on those labor market outcomes. And the sponsorship information comes from, there's kind of two sources that I've been looking at. So the Lutheran Immigration and Refugee Service requests that all of its affiliate offices submit a form anytime that they're pairing a household with a sponsor. And so they have all that information and they've sent it to me. But they've long suspected that because this form is voluntary, there is severe underreporting of sponsorship in their administrative data. And so the data that they have available shows that about 1% of households over the past 10 years have been paired with sponsors, but they know anecdotally that that is a huge undercount. So to try to get a sense for exactly how underreported sponsorship is, they also did a survey last year in 2020. The survey was not the most scientific, so we can't depend on it too heavily, but they did, from that survey, they determined that it was closer to maybe 16% of households who were paired with sponsors. So all that to say, my data is, there are some data quality issues, but I think there's still some really exciting findings when we look into the data. And because I have these two data sources, this administrative data on sponsorship and the survey data, I did conduct my analysis using both data sets. And in general, the trends were very similar across both data sources. There's a few instances where there are some differences, but in particular, because sponsorship is more highly represented in the survey data, my coefficients for most things are stronger and more positive with the sponsorship data than with the administrative data. There's a pretty severe downward bias because of the underreporting of sponsorship. But in general, so I did some basic regression analyses on evaluating the impact of sponsorship on labor market outcomes. In particular, I looked at 3 outcomes: employment status, wages, and time to employment. And I found that households with sponsors on average had an employment rate that was 7.5 percentage points higher than households without sponsors. And considering the employment rate for the sample is about 35%, at that 90 to 180 day mark, this is pretty significant. It's about a 21% difference for households with sponsors versus those without sponsors. I also found that households with sponsors were employed 33 days sooner. And this might not sound like a big deal, but it is in the United States. Refugees are expected to be employed, again, 90 to 180 days after arrival. That's the target. And so 33 days is really quite significant. I did not find significance in terms of the impact of sponsorship on wages when I was using the administrative data, which was kind of like my baseline for all of the analysis. However, when I used the survey data, I found that with that sample, there was those households that were paired with sponsors earned $1.02 per hour more than those without sponsors. So again, it might be that with the administrative data, there's just such a downward bias that it's not detecting it, but it actually might be there. So those are kind of the broad findings. I've done quite a lot of robustness tests and have a lot more I'd love to share with you, but I know I'm at my time. So I'll be happy to answer questions when the time comes.
Thank you so much, Emily. This is such interesting work. I am fascinated in work that looks at the integration impact of sponsorship, and those employment outcomes are really eye-opening. The 16% number particularly really grabbed me. That's amazing. I'd love to learn more about it, and I hope we can do that. Last and definitely not least, I'd like to welcome Pablo Boas to the conversation. And Pablo, again, apologies in advance if I have mispronounced your name. I haven't. Okay, that's very good. Pablo is a migration and urban studies scholar in the Department of Geography and is at the University of Vermont, and is Director of Global and Regional Studies at the University of Vermont. His research focuses on 4 main areas: refugee resettlement in North America and Europe, environmental and forced displacement, cities of the global south, and food security and sovereignty in diverse communities. His work on migration and secondary cities has been recently published in Refugees in New Destinations and Small Cities, Resettlement in Vermont, and his other recent publications have focused on the ethics of research with refugee communities and comparative studies of resettlement in Europe and North America. Welcome, Pablo. It's fantastic to have you with us this morning.
Thank you so much. All of these presentations have been so fascinating, and there's so many questions I have for all the other presenters. So Eliza mentioned, and Emily also gave a good sort of intro into where we are right now in the US in terms of refugee resettlement and this particular moment in which community sponsorship is becoming a huge part of kind of rebuilding, this moment of trying to rebuild the refugee program. I have done a lot of this work that is focused comparatively on especially resettlement into rural areas. And I do a lot of work locally and nationally on evaluating refugee outcomes of refugee programs. So I'm doing work with the school boards and food banks and healthcare and all of these different kinds of things. And one thing that's always struck me is how narrow the lens of evaluating outcomes at all in the US is. And I see one of the questions in the chat is around employment outcomes. In the US, there's really only one thing that is systematically collected in terms of data, and that's whether or not somebody has a job at 90 days and whether or not they have a job at 180 days. Nothing about the nature of that, employment, a match with education or desires, et cetera. And so one of the things that I piloted a few years ago was trying to create this new model of comparing aspirations to outcomes and using a survey method and using kind of a longitudinal study with a small cohort and then building that up. And that's something that I had done with resettled refugees in Vermont and then in New England. And right now, as we enter into this community sponsorship model in the US, where, with the Afghan resettlement, but with resettlement more generally, there are attempts to build on the Canadian model to some degree, some of the experiments going on in Europe as well. And so right now we're at this moment of how do we understand resettlement differently? And so the community sponsorship pilots that are going on right now, there are 30 of these across the US in different communities. This framework where you often hear this building the airplane as you're starting to fly, this is trying to be kind of developed on the ground as it goes. So I've been having these really interesting conversations trying to set up this this new approach to understanding what resettlement looks like for refugees, for community sponsors, for the staff of these different agencies. As Emily mentioned, there are 9 of these different agencies that work nationally across the US. So this is what I'm literally going next week to communities in North Carolina, Wisconsin, Massachusetts, and here in Vermont to try and speak with some of the different partners around what it is that they are looking to measure. So even the metrics of what it is that we want to look at, what are the different experiences of these different communities? So much of what was mentioned earlier about focusing on the volunteers, the networks, the friend networks, this is all kind of on the table. And how do you look at that? How do you actually do this at the same time that you are, we just heard this morning that 100 Afghan refugees are coming this weekend, right? None of this is set up at this stage. There is nothing that is already established in terms of what it is that we will look at, how we will measure it, how this data will be collected, whether the capacity even exists to do that. And I'll just end by saying that, it became very clear during the last US administration that the narrative around, or narratives around, what the value of refugee resettlement is for communities, for the refugees themselves, and for the nation as a whole was lost in many ways. And so there's a very clear political impact to getting this right. And so that's something. I know that was a lot of kind of scattered stuff, but so much of this is going on as we speak. So I'm really eager to engage with the discussion. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Pablo. I'm so excited to learn more about this. I know that in the last month we've seen the launch of the Sponsor Circles program for Afghans arriving through who supported US troops, and obviously, I would love to learn more from you about how that program might interact with the current community sponsorship program, and from Emily as well. But rather, I might not start with that question. There are so many great questions coming in the chat, so I'm going to not be selfish and prioritize other people's questions over my own. So we've got about 15 minutes for questions. I'm going to try and get to everyone's questions that are coming up. To the presenters, if I pose a general question and you want to jump in, please just use the hand raise function and I'll make sure that I get to you. Initially, there's a couple of questions coming in about, I guess, managing for data limitations or managing for cohort specifications. So I might bundle a couple of these together and direct a question to Ryan and Robert, and also a question to Gabriella. So Ryan and Robert, there was a question about, will your project be able to account for pre-existing, I guess, biases or interests that people have in terms of maybe whether they're a member of a faith community before they agreed to sponsor, or whether they've been highly involved in charity work or other forms of volunteering before deciding to sponsor. So I'd like to direct that question to you. Maybe you could talk a little bit more about how you're going to account for those pre-existing conditions, for lack of a better term. And my question to Gabriella for you to be thinking about, there was a question in the chat about, are the evaluators in the different countries that you're speaking to, including policy and legislative changes that have been prompted by sponsorship programs? So, for example, programs specifically around new migrant integration. How will the evaluators manage that? So maybe I'll go first to Ryan and Robert, and then second to Gabriella.
Yeah, really great question. So put very succinctly, yes, we're going to be collecting information on what we call fixed traits, somebody's faith background, were they born in Canada, were they born in another country, were they born to immigrant parents? These are all really important questions that we will definitely ask in order to try to control for that personal history and those fixed various characteristics and traits. The other aspect here, and this is why it was really important to try to compare a pending sponsor group, those sponsors who are on a wait list, to a recently completed one, because those two groups are going to be more similar to each other than to other groups. So somebody who, for example, we're going to compare sponsors to the general population. People who choose to sponsor are going to be more likely in the first place to probably to be volunteering in other aspects of their lives. But by comparing the recently completed sponsorship group to the pending sponsorship group, we hope to sort of control for a lot of those characteristics that might prompt somebody, or that personal history that might prompt somebody to sponsor in the first place, such as a higher level of social participation or volunteerism. That's a very short answer.
That was a very excellent action-packed answer in a short period of time. Thank you, Robert. Gabriella, I'll go to you now.
Sure. Thank you so much for the question. It's a great question, actually. And I should say that one of the reasons why we are including, as also Pablo talked about, the importance of doing interviews and focus groups with different stakeholders. So we're not, for example, just looking at sponsor groups or just refugees. We're also talking to the wider community. We're talking to local authorities. We're talking to state employees. We're talking to employees in the schools. We're talking to people who are working at the federal level who are putting these programs together. And we, of course, want to look at, because the claim has always been, yes, sponsorship is beneficial for integration, but there hasn't been a lot of research that has been done on that. So we also want to see if that's the claim, have there been any changes in the legislation, in policy that reflects this? Has the initial research that has been done on sponsorship, for example, in the UK, has that prompted any changes in integration policy and how refugees are received? We do see some anecdotal evidence, for example, in some countries experimenting with sponsorship light models. So, for example, in the Netherlands, you see resettled refugees or asylum seekers being paired up with mentors or groups of sponsors to facilitate their integration and connect them to different networks. So there is evidence that it is having an impact on the ground. But yeah, we would like to be able to interview different stakeholders that are perhaps developing these policies and legislation to see if if this is really the case, if this is having an influence on their thinking. So yeah, thanks for that great question.
Thank you very much, Gabriella. Be really interesting to see, as you say, how those different dovetail of those different policies and approaches impact on sponsorship and vice versa, I guess. This question, which I think is a really interesting one, I'm going to pose first to Natasha because of your research interest in, that relationship building between newcomers and sponsors, and also the fact that you're doing that qualitative research on the ground, speaking to people who've had this experience. But I'd also open it up to the rest of the panel as well. Nuran in the chat said that, has research looked at how refugee communities create their own sponsorship support groups in host countries before arrival, and asked whether there might be lessons that could be learned in sponsorship programs in resettlement countries like the UK and the US and Canada, that maybe draw on those relationships and the types of support networks that pre-exist. And Nuran, I'll also leave it open to you just to check that I have correctly characterized your question. Excellent. So Natasha, I'd love to know if you have any reflections on that, and then open it up to the panel.
Sorry, I was just finding the question so I could read it again myself. Yeah, I mean, in terms of my research, I mean, I'm only speaking to volunteers, so I don't know whether anybody wants to jump in who's speaking to refugee communities, because I'm not really sure if they have formed support groups before they came. I guess what I probably will say is quite a lot of the volunteers that I spoke to spoke about the value of online communities. This has become, this is quite prevalent in the conversations I had with volunteers, that, sometimes they didn't need to support them on a certain issue because actually they'd spoken to so-and-so who they met through such a Facebook group. And that was really interesting to hear about. And actually some of the families, obviously this is coming from the perspective of the volunteers, but some of the refugee families they were sponsoring had kind of met up in different parts of the country. So they're kind of these community sponsorship groups kind of finding each other through online resources. Yeah, but I guess I don't know if anybody wants to add that is who are actually speaking to the refugees themselves.
Gabriella, you want to jump in?
I mean, it's only anecdotal evidence that we have so far, not so much in the host countries, but similar, because we don't necessarily work with refugees in host countries through this research project. But what we have seen is that, yeah, support groups or refugee peer networks between arrival families is really beneficial for the refugees. We've seen this in the UK and in France, where they have formed these kind of peer support groups, I guess you could say, to share experiences and to talk about, what works, what doesn't, informal networks, how to find a job, how to deal with bureaucracy, all these things. And it also helps just to be able to, speak in their language. I remember one refugee family said how nice it was at the beginning until, they were able to, find their footing and to be able to connect with different refugee families and be able to speak Arabic, and to feel like to talk to others who have gone through similar experiences. So yes, in the arrival country, for sure, I've heard that it's been very beneficial. I couldn't say in terms of the host country.
Thanks. I'll go to Pablo next. You also have your hand up.
Sure. I mean, I think that this is one of the interesting questions that's arisen around community sponsorship, that, we often look at it as the host community versus the newcomers, and really don't recognize, it's not just the white majority in some of these countries. There are many other populations that may be interested in engaging. And certainly in the US, the presence of what are sometimes called the ethnic community-based organizations, which are increasingly involved more formally in resettlement, have played this important role. The challenge, however, is that especially when you're dealing with, newer populations, the Afghan population is a prime example of this, that especially when you're dispersing people all around the country, including to newer locations, the actual, either the knowledge of that place in the countries that they're the transit countries or wherever it is, and especially in the countries of arrival, a lot of those networks simply aren't established, and it's a lot more difficult to build them up. I would say the other big criticism that continues to arise, I know from many of my colleagues in Canada, around sponsorship in general is around the shift of responsibility from the state to private actors in different ways, and how this, what this actually also means, which we don't address as fully. So I don't know how well those networks translate across. I think the comment about social networks is also a really important one. Thanks.
Thank you. I know we're coming up on our time, but I think this is really interesting. I see Naran has her hand up, and then I'd like to go to Jenny as well. Thanks, Naran. Welcome.
Sure. Thank you so much for the answers from all the participants. I think the reason why I'm asking this, of course, it does relate to the research that I'm doing, but also because I believe, yes, maybe there aren't established communities because of the distribution among the country of resettlement, but still they themselves experience this kind of sponsorship or support or community support in the host country. So maybe it would be interesting to learn from these refugees themselves on how they were supported in the countries that they're coming from the host countries, if you're going to say, and how, if there was anything that was interested and helped them, where it could be established or re-established for other nationalities. It shouldn't only be restricted on one nationality, where you do a community for only one nationality of refugees, right? But maybe it would be interesting if you have a diverse community of refugees and talking about their experiences and support that they received in the host countries, and how can they benefit or even create new support for incoming refugees similar to what they have experienced. Because whether we like it or not, in the resettlement country, you have it very structured, you have the resources, you're focusing on the sponsorship program. There is a program that's already there that absorbs them and supports them. But in host countries, they're just going there and they're creating their own pathways and support systems. So it would be interesting to see how resilient they were and learn from their experiences and implemented in the new resettlement countries. But thank you so much. I hope my answer has just reflected why I was asking this question, but thank you so much.
No, thank you very much. And it's a fantastic question. I'm glad we're able to get to it this morning. Jenny, would you like to come in?
We looked extensively at social networks, and in the UK, there's very little pre-arrival orientation for refugees, whether they're arriving under a wider resettlement programme or under community sponsorship. So a lot of the information about the UK, what to expect, etc., came from virtual networks with other refugees. That could lead to confusion, but also insight. So, they expect the way that the schemes run are very different. So you might expect one thing and end up on another scheme because you didn't know. But he also gained a lot of insight, particularly in sponsorship, where the sponsors tend to be middle class and not used to benefits and, making money last to the end of the week and stuff. Real insights into living in poverty, basically, and how to make your money go further, which places to shop and that kind of stuff. Really important.
Thanks very much, Jenny. That's fantastic. And Natasha, I'll go to you next. I just want to let everybody know we've only got a couple minutes left in the session. So just before I go to Tash, I just wanted to thank you all for coming. Tash, do you want to jump in quickly?
Just Jenny speaking reminded me of something that actually it might not necessarily be something that they learned perhaps in the country that they were in before they came to the UK through community sponsorship, for example. But with a lot of the volunteers I've spoken to, when they go on to get their second family or they apply for their third family, actually in quite a few of the cases, the volunteers were joined by members of the refugee family themselves. So they are bringing that perspective, whether it's learned from their experience of being in the UK and part of that scheme, or whether it was learned before. But actually, I do think there is a, they are joining the groups. So they are bringing their perspective in that way. So